Santa Monica, June 2011, apartment 303. An 81-year-old man in a white t-shirt walks into a trap set by the FBI. For 16 years, he was a ghost, a name on the most wanted list right next to Osama bin Laden. When agents breached his walls, they didn't just find a fugitive. They found $800,000 in cash hidden in the drywall and a literal arsenal of 30 firearms. This was James Whitey Bulger. To the South Boston Irish, he was the neighborhood protector. To the families of the 19 people he murdered, he was a sociopath. But the real horror wasn't just his violence, it was his partnership. Whitey Bulger didn't hide from the law. He operated inside the law. While he was strangling rivals and burying them in shallow graves, he was a top echelon informant for the FBI. He proved that the most dangerous place for a criminal to hide is behind a badge. This is the one story of the most scandalous betrayal in American law enforcement history. This is the story of the Devil and the Bureau. In 1938, the Bulger family moved into the old Harbor Village housing projects in South Boston. While intended as a New Deal refuge for young James Whitey Bulger, it was a training ground for defiance. While his younger brother, Billy Bulger, excelled in school and mastered Latin, James was already a regular in the local precinct for larceny and street fighting. Local police branded him Whitey for his shock of platinum blonde hair, a name he despised, preferring to be called Jim. As the years passed, the brothers' paths radically split. Billy navigated the halls of power to become the president of the Massachusetts State Senate, the most powerful politician in the state. Whitey navigated the underworld, graduating from juvenile reformatories to Alcatraz. By the 1970s, the Bulger brothers formed a unique, terrifying duality. Billy controlled the law from the State House, while Whitey controlled the streets from his triple-decker apartment. In Southie, loyalty was the only currency. This family bond created a wall of silence that protected Whitey for decades, making him untouchable by local police who feared either the gangster's bullet or the politician's influence. In 1956, James Bulger was sentenced to 20 years for a string of federal bank robberies. He began his term at the Atlanta Penitentiary, but his stay there would change him in ways no prison sentence ever could. Desperate to reduce his time, Bulger volunteered for what he was told was a medical study to find a cure for schizophrenia. In reality, he had just walked into the jaws of Project MK-Ultra, the CIA's clandestine search for mind control. For over a year, Bulger was administered high doses of LSD almost every single day. The experiments were led by Dr. Carl Pfeiffer, a man secretly funded by CIA chemist Sidney Gottlieb. Bulger and his fellow inmates weren't patients, they were laboratory animals. In his later letters, Bulger described the horror of living nightmares, where the walls dripped blood and his fellow prisoners turned into skeletons before his eyes. He lived in a state of permanent, drug-induced paranoia, terrified that the doctors were recording his thoughts. By the time he was transferred to Alcatraz in 1959, the damage was done. Bulger claimed the experiments warped his soul, leaving him with a hair-trigger temper and chronic insomnia. He became a restless claustrophobic who couldn't sleep without a light on and was prone to sudden explosive violence. While he loved the clear rules of Alcatraz, the island couldn't fix what the CIA had broken. Bulger entered the federal system as a bank robber. He emerged in 1965 as a cold, calculating sociopath who felt he had been violated by the government. He famously wrote, "I was in prison for committing a crime, but they committed a greater crime on me." This sense of victimhood became his justification for every drop of blood he would later spill on the streets of Boston. When Whitey Bulger returned to the streets of Boston in 1965, he didn't just join a gang, he navigated a battlefield. The city was gripped by the Irish gang wars, a bloody feud between the Killeen and Mullen factions. Bulger started as an enforcer for the Killeens, but he was playing a much deeper game. After the leader, Donald Killeen, was gunned down in 1972, Bulger didn't just fill the void, he orchestrated a merger that left him at the top of the Winter Hill Gang. Unlike the Italian mafia in the North End, which relied on elaborate ceremonies and large families, Whitey's crew was a surgical strike team. He kept his inner circle small, men like Stephen the Rifleman Flemmi and hitman John Martirano. He didn't want a social club, he wanted a corporate monopoly. By the mid-70s, Bulger had systematized crime in Boston. If you were a bookie, a drug dealer, or even a legitimate vending machine owner, you paid rent to Whitey, the tax. He famously extorted other criminals, realizing it was safer to rob the robbers than to rob the public. The liquor store office. He ran his empire from the back of South Boston Liquor Mart, where he could hold court while maintaining the image of a local businessman. He didn't just want money, he wanted total environmental control. By the time he solidified his power in 1979, after the conviction of boss Howie Winter, Whitey had achieved a monopoly on misery. He controlled every vice in the city, and anyone who tried to operate outside his system simply disappeared. He proved that a small, disciplined crew with no moral compass could outmaneuver a sprawling mafia family every time. In late 1975, a secret meeting took place at Wollaston Beach in Quincy, Massachusetts. Under the cover of darkness, two men from the same South Boston projects sat in a car, FBI agent John Connolly and James Whitey Bulger. Connolly had grown up idolizing the Bulger family. Now, he was a rising star in the Bureau. He didn't come to arrest Whitey, he came to hire him. This was the birth of the unholy alliance that would corrupt the FBI for the next 20 years. Connolly's pitch was simple. The FBI's #1 priority was crushing the Patriarca crime family, the Italian mafia. To do that, they needed an insider. Bulger, a rival of the Italians, was the perfect candidate. The deal was a deal with the devil. Whitey would feed the FBI intel on the Italians, and in exchange, Connolly and his supervisor, John Morris, would provide Whitey with a license to kill. This wasn't a standard informant relationship. It was a partnership. Connolly began polishing Whitey's files, making it look like he was a vital asset to national security. In reality, Whitey was feeding the FBI scrap metal, information on low-level rivals or cold tips, while the FBI was feeding him gold. Connolly warned Whitey about wiretaps, upcoming police raids, and most lethally, the identities of other informants who were talking about the Winter Hill Gang. With the FBI as his personal security force, Whitey became untouchable. Whenever local Boston police or the state troopers got close to him, Connolly would intervene, claiming Bulger was part of a sensitive ongoing investigation. Whitey wasn't just working for the FBI, he had subverted them. He used the Bureau to eliminate his competition, effectively turning the United States government into the silent partner of the Winter Hill Gang. This was the moment the system didn't just fail, it switched sides. By the 1980s, the alliance between Whitey Bulger and the FBI had morphed into a lethal protection racket. Bulger wasn't just an informant, he was a federally protected mobster. While the FBI's Boston office celebrated the downfall of the Italian mafia, they were simultaneously paving a road of bodies for the Winter Hill Gang. The Bureau didn't just look the other way, they provided the map and the shield. The most chilling aspect of this partnership was the handling of informant. When honest citizens or rival gangsters went to the FBI to report Bulger's crimes, their statements were often handed directly to Agent John Connolly. Connolly would then leak the names to Whitey. One of the most infamous examples was Edward Brian Halloran, who offered to testify about a murder Bulger had orchestrated. Within weeks of talking to the FBI, Halloran was gunned down in broad daylight. Whitey didn't just kill witnesses, he sent a message that the law was his property. This created a surreal war of the badges. Local Boston police and the Massachusetts state troopers knew Bulger was a murderer, but every time they set up a wiretap or a sting, the FBI would tip Whitey off. Bulger would then mock the investigators, walking past their hidden cameras and waving. During this era, Whitey's personal hitman, John Martirano, and his partner, Steve Flemmi, helped him turn South Boston into a graveyard. They buried bodies in the dirt basements of triple-deckers and in the marshlands of the Neponset River. Whitey felt invincible because, in a sense, he was. He was the only criminal in America who had the most powerful law enforcement agency in the world, acting as his private intelligence service. He didn't just have a license to sell drugs or run numbers, he had a government-sanctioned license to kill. By 1981, Whitey Bulger's ambitions had outgrown the narrow streets of South Boston. He set his sights on World Jai Alai, a high-stakes gambling business based in Florida and Connecticut. Bulger and his partner, Steve Flemmi, were already skimming profits from the company through a middleman. But the owner, Roger Wheeler, a wealthy and honest businessman from Tulsa, Oklahoma, began to suspect foul play. Wheeler started an internal audit that threatened to expose the Winter Hill Gang's massive money laundering scheme. While most mob bosses delegate violence to maintain plausible deniability, Whitey Bulger was a hands-on predator. He didn't just order hits, he enjoyed the very mechanics of murder. His preferred method was strangulation. He believed it was the ultimate act of dominance, quiet, intimate, and terrifying. To facilitate this, he turned a quiet residential home at 799 East 3rd Street in South Boston, and later a house in Dorchester, into a literal slaughterhouse. The Dorchester house was located directly across from the South Boston Liquor Mart. It was a mundane triple-decker that hid a dark secret. Bulger used the basement as an interrogation suite for rivals and suspected informants. In one of the most chilling accounts from his associates, Bulger once strangled a young man in the basement, then went upstairs to take a nap while his henchmen, Kevin Weeks and Steve Flemmy, did the dirty work of digging a grave in the dirt floor below. In December 1994, the Unholy Alliance paid its final dividend. As a task force of honest DEA, IRS, and state police officers prepared to unseal a racketeering indictment, Agent John Connolly made one last phone call. He warned Whitey that the cops were coming, and it was time to go. Whitey didn't scramble. He had been preparing for this rainy day for decades. He collected his girlfriend, Catherine Gregg, grabbed his pre-packed go bags filled with cash and false IDs, and drove out of Boston forever. For the next 16 years, one of the most dangerous men in FBI history transformed into a boring retiree. He settled in Santa Monica, California, living in a modest rent-controlled apartment just blocks from the Pacific Ocean. To his neighbors, he was Charlie Gasco, a quiet, elderly man who loved animals and kept to himself. While the FBI placed him on the 10 most wanted list, right next to Osama bin Laden, Whitey was living a life of disciplined invisibility. He didn't use credit cards, he didn't use the internet, and he never stayed in the sun long enough to get a tan that might change his complexion. But inside the walls of his apartment, the monster was still armed. When he was finally captured in 2011, FBI agents found over $800,000 in cash hidden inside the walls and a massive arsenal of 30 firearms, including handguns and rifles, taped into secret compartments throughout the small flat. The search for Bulger became a national scandal. While the Bureau sent agents to Europe and South America following sighting reports, Whitey was walking his dog past the local pier every morning. The man once considered the FBI's star informant had become its greatest embarrassment, demonstrating that the most effective disguise is not power, but invisibility. In June 2011, the longest-running fugitive hunt in FB1 history ended not through high-tech surveillance, but through a chance recognition. A neighbor in Santa Monica, who happened to be a former Miss Iceland, recognized Catherine Gregg from a CNN broadcast. She contacted the authorities, and within days, the FBI lured Charlie Gasco into his apartment garage. At age 81, the King of Southie was finally in handcuffs. The 2013 trial in Boston was a wake-up call for the city. For months, the court heard gruesome details of the 19 murders Whitey was charged with. His former inner circle, men like Steve Flemmy and hitman John Martirano, took the stand to describe how they buried bodies while Whitey took naps. The wall of silence that had protected South Boston for 50 years finally crumbled as the true scale of the FBI's corruption was laid bare for the public to see. The most striking part of the trial was Bulger's own defiance. He sat in the courtroom with a cold, piercing stare, rarely showing emotion. His only outbursts occurred when he was referred to as an informant. To Whitey, being a snitch was the lowest form of existence. He insisted that he never gave the FBI anything valuable. Rather, he had bought the FBI. In his mind, he was a master strategist who had used the federal government as a tool to eliminate his enemies and expand his empire. He viewed the relationship as a business transaction, not a betrayal of the street code. He refused to testify, essentially maintaining his wall of silence until the very end. He was found guilty on 31 counts, including involvement in 11 murders, and was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms. He had outsmarted the government for decades, but time and the truth had finally collected the debt. Whitey Bulger's life ended exactly how it was lived. At age 89, just hours after being transferred to a high-security prison in West Virginia, He was cornered in his cell by inmates with ties to the mafia. They used a padlock inside a sock to beat him to death, reportedly attempting to gouge out his eyes. The man who lived by the code of the street was finally erased by it. Whitey Bulger didn't die in a courtroom or a hospital bed. He died the way he lived, violently, without mercy, and under the rules of the world he helped create. Beaten to death in a prison cell, hours after arriving. His final moments carried no speeches, no protection, no deals, just the silence he had imposed on others for decades. But his death didn't close the real case. The true crime wasn't only the 19 murders or the bodies buried in basements and marshes. It was the rot inside the system that let it happen. An FBI badge meant to stop predators became a shield for one of the worst in American history. Files were altered, witnesses were sacrificed. Justice was delayed not by fear, but by loyalty, ego, and ambition. Whitey believed he had beaten the ultimate game, that he had used the government instead of being crushed by it. And for a long time, he was right. He didn't just corrupt agents, he exposed how fragile institutions become when results matter more than integrity. In the end, the street code he worshipped caught up with him. No informant status, no political connections, no immunity, just a concrete cell and men who didn't care who he used to be. The devil made his deal with the Bureau, and both paid the price.